Alrighty, hello everyone. This is Carlos Garrido from Midwestern Marks. This is the third time I try to do this video. It's cut off twice, so I'm really hoping it doesn't do that once again. I want to talk today about labor, specifically how it is that we have historically thought about labor, about physical labor, the sort of labor that creates a tangible object, an object we can touch and see. Now, this labor, I argue, has historically been looked at as an unfortunate necessity. The only value that we can attain from this labor is in its product and that which it makes for us to consume, the use value item, the use value good that it produces. And although this is something that is definitely valuable, of course, we need food and shelter and all these other great things that labor is able to make. It's important to notice that the process of work itself is something quite valuable. Although the process of work itself has been denigrated by most of Western thought until, I argue, a world historic shift happens in the conception of labor with the philosophy of George Hegel and subsequently with the philosophy of Marx and Engels. Now, the Western world in antiquity, both in Greece and in Rome, considered labor to be an unfortunate necessity that was done by slaves or the lower parts of the citizenry. It was conceived of by someone like Aristotle that in order to contemplate on the more enlightening questions of life, in order to do philosophy and the more fruitful things in life, you needed to live a life of leisure. That means you needed to stay as far away from physical labor as possible. In the Middle Ages, what we find is that there's great stories about poets, about kings, about theologians, priests, and philosophers, but there's no stories about workers. Then in capitalism, I mean, what is there to say? Labor and its exploitation is at the core of society. Labor is reduced to a mere commodity. It is separated from the laborer. The product of labor is separated from the laborer as well. And it exists as the core of why we can have capital in the first place, because of the exploitation of labor. But it is, again, seen as something that is unfortunate. There is no value in labor itself. I mean, Adam Smith saw that the value in labor being its product is something so obvious that it required absolutely no explanation. And this has been the general consensus under capitalism. The value of labor is in the fact that it makes something we can consume. This changes with the philosophy of George Hegel. For George Hegel, labor, the process of working itself, creates the conditions for the possibility of a liberatory moment. It is something that we can enjoy and value in itself. So take, for instance, I just did a recent article about this. I've done two now on this topic, but for Hegel in the Phenomenology of Spirit, perhaps the most read text in his literature is this section on the Lord and Bondsman dialectic, where you have the encounter of two self-consciousness with each other. They're looking to attain recognition from the other person, but they're both not willing to give up their condition as the self-consciousness. They're not willing to reduce themselves to an object, and so they end up fighting. And they realize very quickly that if one kills the other, they won't be able to get recognition from someone who's dead. So one ends up submitting to the other, and we end up at the Lord and Bondsman dialectic. Now, Hegel says that early on, we might think that it is the master or the Lord which has the capacity to be a truly free, independent self-consciousness. But he argues that he cannot, because when he engages with the laborer, since the labor has been reduced to a thing, basically a commodity, a slave, the slave cannot give the recognition a free individual can. And so the master is still incomplete. He's unable to affirm himself as a true self-consciousness. Now, Hegel ends up saying that it is actually the laborer, the slave, the bondsman, who is able to eventually affirm himself as true self-consciousness. And if we read closely, we notice that it is because he works, because he's able to engage in this fruitful activity, because he's able to negate himself and externalize, or what we in the Marxist tradition call objectification, because he's able to produce an object that he's able to then look at and see, well, the object is independent and I am a dependent being. Well, how can a dependent being create an independent object? Maybe I can affirm myself as free. So for Hegel, after this skirmish takes place, you have the Lord and Bondsman dialectic, and the bondsman is able to eventually affirm himself as the true self-consciousness because he is able to labor and because he is able to meaningfully engage with his product of labor and see it as something that has a certain sense of independence. Then in the philosophy of right, which he writes 13 years later, we have again the affirmation of labor as being itself something that is quite liberatory. He engages with certain philosophers that romanticize a state of nature in which we didn't have to work, in which nature just gave us the things that we needed at hand. And he says, you know, what these people get wrong is that labor is itself a moment of liberation. Labor itself creates the conditions for human freedom. Labor itself is something that is valuable. Yes, it also creates a product that is valuable, but it is the labor in itself which is the first moment of value. He ends up saying that what we do when we labor is ingrain our soul into something. So he has a, you know, somewhat romanticized view of labor, but at the core, what we find is a shift in recognizing the activity of work itself as something deeply meaningful, as something that's valuable for human life and central for human life. Now, I argue that this same spirit is, of course, sustained by Marx and Engels, but whereas Hegel comes into contradictions because he doesn't want to accept a full-blown slavery, a full-fledged alienation of labor, he considers it to be, when we consider it in a totalizing manner, inalienable. He, on the other hand, wants to accept what I consider to be a piecemeal alienation, an alienation bit by bit, which is the sort of alienation that you find in wage labor. You're not selling your whole self, but you're selling a specific amount of time. You're selling your labor power for a specific amount of time. And he considers this to be okay. And because he does, he runs up on certain contradictions, which I argue that Marx and Engels end up fixing because they use his original embryonic shift and they take it to its logical and practical conclusions. But nonetheless, it's a very laudable discovery, a very laudable world historic shift, how I refer to it, that Hegel ends up creating in our conception of what it means to labor. Now, what does this mean concretely today? Well, there's a lot of people on the left and some prominent theorists even, specifically more so on the anarchist left, who consider labor to be bad in itself. They look at the conditions of exploitative labor and alienated labor, and they argue for a post-work society, a society where we don't have to work. And this is a big mistake. This is a very big mistake, and we must not be fooled by it. Our tradition of Marxism, and even in Hegel, as I argue, who's the first person who starts this tradition, our tradition sees that work is itself something very, very valuable. It is the way that we can collaboratively imbue nature with our specific subjectivity. We can take our creative, mental, and physical capacities and transform nature with it. And we can do that alone. We can do that with other people. It's basically what Marx calls the life activity of humanity. It's something that is integral, that it's fruitful in itself, and which in communism we'd be able to do it under non-exploitative, non-alienating conditions. So we must not look at labor and denigrate it in general. We must recognize that no, labor is meaningful. And the few moments that we find meaningful interactions in our life under the wretchedness of capitalism are those moments where we're able to labor in those instances where we overflow the logic of capital. If you've ever had the opportunity to do craft projects at home, or to participate in sports, or to parent, or to do any other sort of activity that has been able to be done outside of the logic of capital or partially outside of it. Those are some of the most meaningful moments in our lives. And those are moments where we're able to express ourselves creatively, use our mental and physical capacities, collaborate with others, and transform nature. And in doing so, we get these great events that are the ones that we end up recalling for the rest of our lives. So labor is something quite meaningful. We shouldn't look at labor as something bad, as something that we should strive to not do one day, but as something we should strive to be able to do one day freely and under non-exploitative conditions. We should be able to do it voluntarily and express ourselves creatively in this labor. This is what the fundamental motto of communism is: from each according to their abilities, to each according to their needs. From each we have the capacity to work according to how much they want to work and how much they can work, right? And so in essence, if you're a Marxist, if you consider yourself in the tradition of Marxism, do not fall for this phony anarchist or left-wing liberal denigration of labor. Labor is something that is meaningful and which we've always considered meaningful in our tradition. Thank you. This is Carlos Garrido signing out.